thank you everyone for joining us here at LIDC today for this exciting event about partnerships and the Sustainable Development Goals. Just a bit of housekeeping first. We can ask you to please keep your microphone muted and cameras off while our presenters speak. That would be great. There will be a Q&A at the end where you will be able to ask questions to our panel. You can indicate that you want to speak by raising your hand. If you want to tweet from this event, then you can use at LIDC _UK, and hashtag is LIDC seminars. This event is being recorded, and we will publish a recording of this on the website after. So I will first hand over to my colleague Anna, who will talk a little bit more about LIDC before we pass it on to Claire, who will chair this event.
Great, thank you, Gun. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. So today, just for the benefit of those of you joining us who don't know about the LIDC and what we do, and specifically how we work with non-governmental organizations, I'm going to provide you a very, very brief overview of who we are and how we work. So LIDC is a consortium of 7 university institutions based in London who have an interest in working in international development. It is a membership organization. We have a number of staff, students and alumni from our member institutions, but we also have a growing number of NGO members, and I will give you some examples of how this membership works and what the benefits are to NGOs. And our mission is really to facilitate interdisciplinary research, training and events focused on important complex challenges in international development. Specifically, we work in complex interdisciplinary projects, ideas and problems, and we seek solutions for those. So our research is very much impact oriented. It is also disruptive and world leading because of course it's solutions we're talking about. And underpinning such solutions is really a very active communication with all the stakeholders involved, be they the end users, to their NGOs, to the policymakers or local governments. So everyone who really has an interest and who is going to benefit from this research. Our research focus, as I said, is on various areas of international development, focused on the complex challenges facing society. Our research themes can be summarized perhaps in the ones that are listed here. So climate change is an area of very important interest, education, food and health, migration, poverty, and inequality. And cross-cutting all these areas, all these research themes are the idea and the site of innovation, impact, providing resilience and risk. Those are really our ideas. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a few logos of a number of projects that LIDC has supported, developed, some of which are still hosted within the LIDC premises and with which we keep a very close relationship. I would like to highlight our flagship project, which is the UK RIGCRF Action Against Stunting Hub. This is a nearly 20 million award in UK research and innovation, which was awarded only to 12 projects in the UK, led by scientists in the UK, but focused on challenges affecting low and middle income countries. As the name suggests, this project is focused on transforming research on child stunting, understanding child stunted in its entirety. This means using a whole child approach and a very interdisciplinary approach to this problem, trying really to find solutions for it. The focal countries are India, Indonesia, and Senegal, and the lead organizations are London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and LIDC. And if you want more information about the project, the linked website is below, and I'm sure my colleagues will be able to share that in the chat. So focusing on NGO membership, because the main purpose of today's event is our interaction with our partners in non-governmental organizations. So what are the benefits of joining LIDC if you are an NGO? Firstly, you can join our research beats. We are very, very interested in working, in having our academic community working with practitioners and people in the field, especially charities. And this spans a range of projects. You can be talking about a project like the Stunting Hub with 20 million project, huge, with lots of countries and lots of partners involved, but also smaller bids as well, depending on the themes and the interest of our partners. Another advantage for NGOs to join LIDC is that they can publicize employment opportunities and initiatives in our website and newsletter, and they can also build on our existing communication channels to broadcast and advertise their own activities in the various areas where they act. Thirdly, our NGOs can also join our communities of practice, and we have a number of those at LIDC focused on the various research themes we work on. And these communities of practice really aim to be a platform to give a voice to the various actors in given areas of international development, to really promote a very open dialogue, to really help develop research projects that are impact driven and solutions focused. And here is an example of a communities of practice event, specifically a roundtable event that took place just before lockdown at LIDC. The focus of this event was childhood resilience, more specifically the challenges in delivering good quality education in conflict and crisis settings. And really to discuss such a complex problem, we had to bring together actors in the field, academics who can really contribute with their research to ameliorate these problems, but also multilateral agencies. So this was a very successful event where we had participation of local and international NGOs, but also multilateral agencies like UNICEF, UNESCO, the World Bank, and the World Food Programme, and more events of this nature, either virtually or presential, will come up in the near future. So please watch the LIDC events webpage. These are just some pictures of other very exciting events that have happened at LIDC recently. For example, a hackathon between LIDC and UCL, where the students were asked to provide solutions for the key problems that humanity is facing. It was quite an ambitious endeavor, but it was very, very interesting to get people talking together. Another example was a parliamentary roundtable discussion on malnutrition, and we have a number of other events that you can check out on our website. So just to summarize, for the NGOs that are interested in joining us, they will be able to publish their latest news and initiatives on our website and social media channels. They'll be invited to speak at our events. They can take part in our research proposals, and they can publish blogs or interviews if they're interested. And that was it from me. Thank you very much, and I look forward to a very interesting event.
Thanks, Anna. That was really great. Thanks for that. So, welcome everybody to our event on Stronger Together, Partnership for the Global Goals. And we felt that it was really important in the context of COVID to revisit SDG 17 and really look at our ability to reach this goal in the current climate. And, you know, and as you're all aware, meeting all of the goals, but particularly SDG 17, depends on increasing, not decreasing, global investment. But of course, with COVID, I think the UN projects the global economy is going to decrease by 3%. Might be more than that. I think that's a minimum figure. They're expecting, you know, we know that what's in front of us will be sort of the worst global depression since the Great Depression. So aid levels are falling, and they're falling dramatically. And most donor countries have not and will not live up to their pledges with regards to development finance. But we also hope today to discuss how partnerships, particularly in global development research, are being reconceptualized. And this is very much linked to the Black Lives Matters movement. So we have one SDG 17. It's currently being buffeted by two big global events, one health related, one social, and our speakers have the very unenviable task of unpacking all of this for us. And I, for one, can't wait to hear what they have to say. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Louisa Gosling. She's worked for WaterAid since 2010. She's currently a senior WASH manager. She leads on the processes for strengthening partnership practice at both the national and international level. Louise is chair of the Rural Water Supply Network, and it brings together over 11,000 members working on different aspects of rural water across the globe to share experience and learning. She has over 30 years of experience in the global development sector and has worked across a wide number of institutions. Welcome, Louisa.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Great. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to this webinar, because sort of collaboration and partnership is definitely an area that I'm completely committed to, and have been leading on this work in WaterAid, but also through the Rural Water Supply Network, thinking really how do we make the most of a sort of collaborative arrangements in order to address all the challenges that we face. So I'm going to talk a little bit about WaterAid's experience on partnership, and I look forward to further discussion and unpacking this with the other speakers and the questions. So we have WaterAid. We have a partnership framework which sets out our position and approach on partnership, and feel that working in partnership is absolutely fundamental to achieving the kind of change that we're looking through SDG 6, which is water and sanitation. To achieve any kind of change at scale, but also with sustainability, having partnership is completely fundamental to that. And we know that political leadership, a capable and well-resourced water, sanitation and health sectors, as well as informed and motivated citizens, all together are crucial to ensure to deliver clean water, sanitation and hygiene services continuously. But the kind of scale of change that we need to getting these services, to making sure they're universal and lasting, is absolutely massive. And we can't do it just by sort of having lots of disconnected projects. So it's really only possible through deep collaboration within and across sectors. Water and sanitation hygiene, it cuts across. There's water, there is a sector, a kind of WASH sector loosely, but to get change also, it's absolutely has to be integral to health, education, infrastructure, and so on. So we need to also get that collaboration across sectors, and also build momentum for the kind of investment that's needed through lots of voices, spreading ideas and collective action. And we know that we'll only achieve our vision through collaborating with a very wide range of partners. And so the kind of partners that WaterAid works with are a lot of different government partners, so relevant ministries at national level, but also local level, and agencies, government agencies. Civil society are very key, especially in sort of holding to account side. Academia, we do quite a lot of research with academia, both northern based and southern based. Private and public sector in terms of service provision. And we're looking to kind of really improve policy and practice. And so WaterAid is going from being a kind of an implementing agency that has given support for providing services, to really seeing our role as a catalyst and an agent of change, which is enabling local institutions to make and to sustain really long-term improvements in access to WASH. And this is aligned with SDG 7, but also there are other sector-specific initiatives like Sanitation Water for All and other alliances that have partnership principles that we subscribe to. So who are our partners? As I mentioned, many stakeholders working across many sectors, and also at many levels. So we have colleagues working in collaborations that are doing advocacy at global level. We had colleagues have been involved in high-level political forum meetings on SDGs over the last couple of days. So we collaborate with big other stakeholders involved in WASH at the global level, regionally, and for regional bodies like Africa Africa Water Association. There's regional and local bodies, and then also called nationally and sub-national and community levels. So we're we're collaborating at all of those different levels. And of course, we also have partnerships that are to do with funding. So we have strategic partners with donors, philanthropic institutions, and so on. But I'm going to focus mainly on the partnerships to actually deliver our work. Although funding partnerships are also becoming, you know, many similar principles apply. So we have in our partnership framework, we say we have 4 basic principles that frame our approach. So first is complementarity and synergy, meaning that we need to have a shared vision and also recognize the contribution added value that each partner brings. So we have a shared vision, but partners each bring a different added value. Mutual respect and support, recognizing that each partner has a right to determine its own organizational direction and priorities. It's not a matter of subcontracting, you know, a work to another organization. It's that mutual respect and support is very important. Thirdly, accountability, being answerable to each other as partners and to wider stakeholders, including, importantly, communities, governments, as well as donors. And equity, ensuring decision-making processes are as fair as possible within the reality that very unequal power relations exist, but making efforts to increase the capacity of less powerful partners to engage in decision, you know, in really working together. Now, all of these are very nice principles, but it's a challenge to do this in practice. So we know that working with very different kinds of organizations means negotiating different priorities, different incentives, different power struggles, different sort of alliances, and of course it's all quite and often very sort of internal politics and, you know, political context. And these kind of challenges are exacerbated by the kind of restriction on finance that you've just mentioned. Also competition, effectively organizations are competing for visibility, which can undermine collaboration. And also really importantly, and as I think you've been discussing in this network, the neo-colonial dynamics that are embedded in aid relationships between northern and southern organizations. And so how do we really, you know, achieve this complementarity, mutual respect and support, and so on. So all of these kind of different organizations, academic institutions, government institutions, large national NGOs and civil society organizations, movements, networks, disabled persons organizations, all have very different constituencies, very different procedures, and also very different incentives affecting the day-to-day practicalities of working together to deliver, to produce something, a common goal and a common vision. As an international NGO, we have what I would call our kind of comfort zone partnerships, which are the more traditional relationships with local NGOs, local CSOs to deliver outputs of projects that are funded by donors, which is a very kind of quite a linear top-down relationship in practice. But as we're trying to contribute more to really be as I mentioned, a catalyst and agent of change for sustainable change, then those kinds of relationships are just not okay. You know, they don't work, they're not sustainable. So we need much more kind of converting ourselves to relate to other organizations in a different way. So that's a kind of the general, all of those that apply to partnerships in general. But I wanted to talk a bit about what's changing in COVID-19. I think there's opportunities and challenges. The real opportunity is this urgency, the common urgency and the need to collaborate and to learn quickly across the sector about what works. So that has helped to put aside some of the kind of competitive behaviours that that can be a problem in collaboration. And there's some really good sort of experiences of WASH clusters, national plans, like really joining up planning at national level to work together against COVID, joint calls for action, because water, sanitation, hygiene is still not being prioritised in investment by governments or donors. The focus is still tends to be on health and short-term interventions rather than the sort of long-term development in WASH that's needed to be resilient to these the current crisis, but also future shocks. And to some extent, collaboration is also facilitated by the lockdown. So there have been lots and lots of webinars. We've done lots of webinars, and in some ways, that kind of joint sharing of experiences, there's been more of it and more people signing up for it. But of course, that's not very equal. It's easy for the organisations with good connectivity, but much more difficult to communicate with some of our partner organisations that don't have electricity, good constant electricity and data and so on. So the question there is, what's on balance? Is this increasing collaboration, or is it just making it less equal? That's a question. Also, the difficulty of operating in the field. WASH requires people to be out doing things in communities, in schools, in health centres. And there's a huge stringency now on operating procedures to ensure safety of partners and all the people involved and communities, and the uncertainty of long-term funding. So that is adding difficulties and combining that to the uncertainty about the financing, which is putting a lot of our partners under a lot of stress. Also, I think it's in this kind of crisis, we're moving between humanitarian and development oriented work, which is kind of different sorts of partnerships, different drivers and so on. So in relation to this, I've been involved in a series of webinars which have been led by my colleagues in the West Africa, our West Africa regional office. We originally were planning a big face-to-face conference about how, the same question being discussed here, how do we really collaborate more effectively to get to SDG 6. But in the context of COVID, we decided to focus really how our current collaborations in response to COVID can be more effective in the short term and the long term, and also to make commitments on how our existing collaborations can be more successful. And we had an initial webinar that really highlighted the importance of developing collaborative relationships with mutual benefits, that we have to focus on ways of really strengthening each other through our collaborations, so that the collaboration strengthens all these different voices and different areas of really adding value, in particular the civil society organisations, the national organisations that are closest to the people who are, to the people in communities, and particularly the most marginalised communities. So how do we have relationships that can make those that are win-win relationships for everybody? And also we need to bring into these collaborations the private sector, government actors, everyone who's involved kind of needs to be there. So that was one key sort of takeaway from the discussions. And so the recommendations really were how to combine our strength for more joined up advocacy, to target the different areas of government, the different stakeholders, the different donors, to bring together our different areas of strength, our different communities and constituencies. Another huge common concern is really the use of money and governance and accountability. There's a lot of money being poured into the COVID response, and a lot of the existing structures are all in sort of emergency mode. So where is the money going, and how can these collaborations make sure that this is benefiting the people it's intended to benefit? And finally, as I mentioned, the role and participation of local organisations, especially the civil society organisations, have a voice at the table, at the national table and planning, because at the moment they don't. They're being squeezed out by the bigger agencies. So just in conclusion, collaboration is absolutely essential. It has to happen, and the crisis of COVID does bring people together for a common cause. But the funding restrictions, competition, insecurity can drive perverse incentives on collaboration. So we need to really look at those relationships. And as an international NGO, how do we ensure the genuine partnership that really ensures proper participation of national organisations, especially with this focus, the Black Lives Matter, on sort of decolonialism and nationalising the development action. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Louisa. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about that. All right, thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Romina Istrati, and Romina is a research associate at the Department of Development Studies at SOAS. Her work focuses on applying reflexive, decolonial, and community-centered methodologies, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. She is SOAS's Global Challengers Research Officer, where she works on improving the processes involved in building effective international partnerships. She's a member of the Decolonizing SOAS Working Group. She currently coordinates the SOAS Oxford Research for Development series, which aims to change the narrative around development research. Welcome, Romina.
Thank you for having me, Claire. I very much enjoyed Lisa's presentation. I think mine will follow well with what Lisa said. So let me just pull out my presentation very quickly. And let me know if you can see it. Okay, can you all see it?
Perfect.
Lovely. Just one very quick thing. I'd like to close the video panel. Just 1 second. Is it better now? Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
We can hear you, Romina, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I had to exit because I thought that you can't hear me. So I'll just go into the presentation. Can you hear me all?
Perfect.
Great. Okay, so I'd like to offer a bit, perhaps a more reflexive and reflective presentation today. I had very little time to put it together. I'd like to essentially offer a more critical view on the language of equitable partnerships, which I have dealt with from my positionality, and perhaps offer a different alternative to speaking about reflective and reflexive, dialogical, and honest partnerships. So this is informed by, sorry, for some reason I can't move my presentation. Okay, so this is informed by my own background and relevant initiatives recently. I have a decades working with local communities to bridge theory, international development theory, with lived experiences, and ensuring that that theory really engages with communities. And so, whatever approaches are being taken locally do engage with communities. I was also involved recently with decolonizing research at SOAS. We had a very important event, conversation event that brought funders, institutions, and research managers and administrative staff together to try and apply decolonial lens to research structures and practices in higher education institutions, but also beyond them. And currently, as Claire said, I'm part of this series, which really aims to take a step forward to raise more systematically, the ethical issues around international development practice, but also to change the narrative that expertise is always associated with the West. And as Claire said, I am working as GCRF project officer, which actually gives me a lot of insight in how our own researchers are building collaborations in the countries we work in. And I'm currently leading a project, in fact, inside SOAS to understand how to improve our processes. So I'd like to draw from all these experiences and all these initiatives for this presentation and share some lessons that we've learned. This is a report that emerged from the recent event that applied a decolonial lens, and you can read it and see in detail the discussions we had. For today, I'll just try to take a closer look at the language of development and what I see as a problem of elusiveness, and apply that critique to the language of equitable partnerships and SDGs, which again links to the idea of impact within this field, and then offer some directions of how we can move towards substantiating partnerships and how we can move forward, precisely what Luisa said before me, and then take a look at how COVID-19 has really impacted these conversations and what additional lessons we can learn there. So just very briefly, some working definitions. Within scholarship, we oftentimes use long terms, but we rarely define them. And I'd like to define this properly so that we can all follow precisely what I'm talking about. So when I speak of epistemology in this presentation, I refer to a system of criteria and standards for validating what counts as knowledge, which is ultimately linked to worldview, as Gloria Ladson-Billings has noted before. So essentially, that means that we are all situated, right, epistemologically situated. And that means that we are informed by our own beliefs and knowledge systems, preconceptions, and theoretical assumptions when we do international development, whether research or practice. And it's important to understand that historically, Western epistemology has dominated, and that this has been embedded inevitably in colonial and post-Enlightenment legacies, right? International development itself was built on a legacy of the civilizing mission, and this might make us uncomfortable, but we need to face that reality. It is important to understand then how our development research and practice approaches are always informed and limited by our situated knowledge, and try to be reflexive about that and transparent about its effects in our practice throughout the research or project process. Now, what are the epistemological and practical dangers of international development language that I see? One phenomenon that I've seen in the past 10 years that I work in this field is that language oftentimes is used euphemistically. Oftentimes terms describe an ideal or what is politically correct, a politically correct version of reality, but not necessarily reality itself, which is oftentimes uncomfortable, right? So we've seen many times concepts in development tend to become myths, buzzwords, or development speak. And this is precisely because language is oftentimes used without substance. And because of this elusiveness, oftentimes the language doesn't really help us understand what directions we need to follow to achieve the concept that is being signified, which is, I will illustrate that with the concept of equitable partnerships. The other problem is that language oftentimes can perpetuate epistemological hierarchies. I don't like to police language and believe in freedom of expression, but the binary that I keep seeing, developed countries, I find very problematic because again, it perpetuates these perceptions that, somebody's in a place of superiority. If we want to speak about economic growth, yes, we can say high income and low and middle income, but income doesn't have to do with development, right? Development is something much more complex and it's not reduced to income. And finally, simplified generic and symbolic language can obfuscate, in fact, local conceptual repertoires and embodied experiences. So local peoples and communities own concepts and understandings of their own realities. And it's really important to understand those concepts because they can help us to understand why things happen the way they do and how they can be alleviated, if there are pernicious norms or attitudes that need to be changed. So how do we apply this critique to equitable partnerships? Before I move to that, I'd just like to very quickly take a look at the definitions currently. And this is the use of language in funding for development. So, as we are exposed to it in academia. So emphasis is placed by funders on interdisciplinarity and partnerships building through collaborative research projects, involving researchers from the UK and aid recipient countries or DAC-listed countries to address global challenges. Co-production, capacity building, equitable partnerships, and impact are all funder priorities. And these priorities seem to be informed again by research that shows that when international development practice and research are co-produced and co-authored, then they tend to have more impact. However, it's still an elusive and problematic language because although a lot has been said about the problems of building those partnerships, and increasingly funders have given more attention, for instance, to gender equality UQRI has introduced a gender equality statement that encourages researchers to think of how their research affects different stakeholders and different people of different positionalities within the research, and also apologies. And other other efforts by the funders to look at the barriers to equitable partnerships, but at the same time, not enough attention has been given to how teams that are cross-cultural, imbricated in post-colonial power hierarchies, and simultaneously comprised of researchers and communities, of multiple intersectional identities and positionalities again, how to work with that and how to navigate that landscape hasn't really been thoroughly discussed in my experience. And there's also the structural and material factors that suggest, that equitable partnerships are in some aspects, in fact, unrealizable. In most research funding calls, again, eligibility criteria, but also due diligence expectations tend to place more decision-making power, accountability, and thus also epistemological and material benefits, in the hands of the UK-based PI or the Western researcher. And while cross-sectoral partnerships are encouraged in most of GCRF schemes, for instance, there is no thorough discussion of the challenges of working across sectors, academia, NGOs, government agencies, especially in the international or LMIC context. So this is a report from the UQRI titled "Promoting Equitable and Fair Research Partnerships." That report, held multiple consultations to identify some of the systemic barriers to equitable partnerships, and evidently there's a lot of structural, normative, and sort of practical parameters that really don't allow for these partnerships to happen in an equitable manner. So it's evident that the language is sort of elusive, and we need to think of a more pragmatic language, I guess, that truly communicates the problems that exist. There's also limitations with the SDGs discourse that I think we need to keep in mind. I do understand that there is a benefit in having a common language and goals to work towards, but we need to be aware of the limitations of the narrative. Because of the epistemological and material inequalities, some of which I named, priorities might not necessarily reflect, local or communities' understandings of development issues or needs. I was part of an HRC-funded series of workshops a few years ago that actually explored the extent to which faith-based organizations had been integrated in the consultation towards the formulation of the SDGs. And that proved that, their integration was quite weak in Ethiopia, India, and the UK. And also the exclusive focus on the SDGs, which unfortunately tend to be associated with LMICs. I mean, SDGs should have global relevance, but because of this association, I think it also stifles collaboration between high-income and low and middle-income countries to tackle, a shared problem such as the current public health crisis. So I think it stifles the two-way knowledge exchange, or it could stifle it. And this links to conceptualizations of impact within research for development, where GCRF funding is linked to the ODA-related concept of value for money, and those who work in the NGO world and with donors would know what I'm talking about. The concept is impact is mostly understood in relation to economic growth for DAC-listed countries, and for those who work in social sciences or in culture sensitive long-term development interventions, they know that these kind of conceptualizations of impact are problematic. But also impact can be understood very differently depending on the positionality of the stakeholder, right? The Western or international or non-local lead or organization might have very different understanding than the LMIC researchers, depending on their positionality as well, or the communities themselves. So the question here is, whose conceptualization of impact will prevail when funding availability and other structural parameters tend to place power, on the Western PI lead organization and so forth. So having set out the issues, I think there is a way to move toward a language that is more substantive really, and an approach that admits these issues and tries to work around them. From the consultations I've held with SUAS academics so far, and my own experience, I have three key insights to talk about. One is that whether a project will achieve effective and fruitful partnerships will depend on how it is structured, right? And how the project idea itself is developed, not just the implementation part. When it is developed by a single non-local PI lead or organization, it's likely that when local partners or communities are brought into the conversation, they won't influence the direction of the project. I also believe that partnerships can become more effective when projects are conceptualized, in a dialogical manner with researchers, communities, and other stakeholders, preferably of diverse backgrounds, and when all sides have clear, explicit expectations of what the project's objectives are, and not only the objectives, but also the methodology and the role that each partner will have in that project and its implementation. And I do believe that it's imperative to take a contextualized approach to understanding local issues and to suspend, easy explanations just because we have a language that makes that possible. I do believe that when we truly engage with communities, their conceptualizations of the problems and their lived experiences, we can achieve a realness factor that I think international development language sometimes lacks. So some more concrete suggestions to achieve strong, reflexive, and dialogical partnerships. I do believe that it's important to be reflexive of our limitations and honest about the expectations of the project. To consider also how to accommodate multi-vocal narratives in the conceptualization of projects, and to engage local researchers, community-based stakeholders, to peer review these projects in some form, if possible. I would also highly encourage linguistic training when undertaking local community work. It is important to understand that having translators has limitations. Of course, speaking local language doesn't eschew these issues, but I think it helps to build understanding and to earn, importantly, people's respect and trust. It is important to attribute and credit the work fairly, regardless of the rank of the personnel involved. Having worked in consultancy for many years, I think there is this issue or situation where the more senior name is included in project, and then the work is delegated to lower ranking staff who are not explicitly acknowledged oftentimes. We really need to consider issues of intellectual property if we do want to work and co-produce as we say we do, and make sure that local researchers and communities and stakeholders can, who are interested in this, can publish and can use the research they produce for local impact, because again, the way we understand impact and the way local communities or stakeholders understand impact can be quite different. And finally, I'd like to take a very quick look at challenges and opportunities in the COVID-19 pandemic and post-pandemic era. The development industry has evidently been affected in many ways. Mobility and travel has been restricted. Programs may have been delayed or discontinued. Institutions have had to, adapt and change their modus operandi, going virtual. But with the webinar series we have done with Oxford, and we invite speakers from the countries we work in, Ethiopia, Kenya, India. We've had multiple speakers from different countries, and they've raised some very important points that I'd like to highlight here. The overall lesson is that the situation has mobilized actually local effort and research to address both the epidemiological crisis, but also the development challenges around it. Dr. Ephraim Tessema, a social development advisor from Ethiopia, noted that the crisis led local rural development agents to communicate virtually, thus enabling them to collaborate differently and more effectively. Dr. Judy Mumbo from the African Academy of Sciences in Kenya, she spoke quite in detail about Africa-led and Asia-led. Other speakers refer to Asia, scientific research to investigate context-specific questions. So a lot of local mobilization and autonomous science-driven approaches to resolve these issues. And I think that this actually points to some opportunities to bring to change the way things happen in a positive way, and perhaps to really decolonize and effectively those more harmful practices, and legacies of the sector. If non-local PIs, leads, or organizational staff are facing mobility challenges currently, I think this could actually leave some room for local counterparts to take the lead to really for Western researchers and partners to appreciate the resourcefulness of their local partners. I also think that the travel bans could, do mean fewer conferences and meetings, and in my experience, these tend to be reserved for those in elite roles or high-ranking positions, and going virtually can actually make some of that knowledge more widely accessible. The change in modus operandi from physical to virtual, again, I think can be quite positive, as Louise suggested. You can have more dialogue, although internet connection is an issue in multiple countries. And I think that the crisis evidences that LMICs have a wealth of knowledge in addressing public health crises such as the current one, and can in fact advise higher income societies in this domain. So I do think that what we're seeing currently actually in practice is a two-way knowledge exchange being set in motion, and hopefully a shared learning that I think we should move toward. And I'll end here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Romina.
Thank you. Sorry for the technicalities initially.
That's okay. That's okay. All right. And our final speaker is Dr. John Young. He's the Executive Director of the International Network for Advancing Science and Policy, which works with partners in the North and the South towards putting research and knowledge at the heart of global development. And before this, he was 17 years at ODI. I'm sure many of you know his work from there. And prior to that, he spent 20 years working in Kenya and Sri Lanka and Indonesia, developing, testing new approaches to rural development and decentralized public service. And now John reckons that he has experienced more or less every sort of international research and development partnership there is, from more or less every perspective, and equitable partnerships are a key value underpinning all of his work. And I would heartily agree with that. Welcome, John.
Very good. Thank you very much, Claire. Let me try and share my screen. Why is it not showing? There we are. Can you see that?
Yep.
Perfect.
Okay, very good. So I thought I'd better do a bit of research before I started to talk. I better find out, well, what is this SDG 17? I must admit I've been totally confused by them ever since they came up. SDG 17, partnerships for the goals. The sort of high-level summary is very simple. Strengthen the means of implementation, revitalize global partnership for sustainable development. But like all of the others, that covers a bewildering range and number of sub-goals. So 17.1 to 5 are about finance, 6 to 8 about technology knowledge, 17.9 is about capacity building, 10 to 12 are about trade, 13 to 19 are about systemic issues, which is basically everything else that has to happen to enable partnerships to happen. So it's really about the whole of the development process. But within that last group, 17.15 and 17.16, are specifically about establishing multi-stakeholder partnerships, which, and I think these words are important, respect each country's policy space and leadership, and mobilize and share knowledge, expertise, technology, and financial resources. And that's really the bit that I'm going to talk about today. And most of what I'm going to talk about, I've actually learned through personal experience. And this is me as a VSO volunteer back in the early 80s, which I think is a fantastic way to learn about partnership and the development process. Utterly powerless, relatively, well, quite extremely ignorant, I would say, fantastically culturally insensitive. The only way to get anything done is actually to get to know people, find out what they want to do and see if there's a way of helping them to do that better. And that kind of mantra really pretty much underpinned the next organization I worked for, which was then called the Intermediate Technology Development Group. And now it's called Practical Action. And I worked for them in Kenya. And I soon discovered that actually bringing all stakeholders together to try and decide what to do and how to do it was the most important, best way of trying to get things done. And we worked there on village animal healthcare programs, bringing together farmers, government staff, private sector people selling drugs, etc. And it was pretty much the same when I worked in Indonesia, a big DFID-funded program to develop, test and promote a decentralized client-focused livestock services. Though at that time I was working within the government, and that work, particularly working with district level government staff, working very closely with farmers, resulted in a whole bunch of new services being developed and extremely popular with farmers and also with field level government staff. But actually, nothing fundamentally changed until the 1998 financial crisis in Indonesia, which led to the political crisis and the sudden collapse of the highly decentralized Suharto regime, and then the civil society demand for more decentralized and accountable government. And that created the conditions in which decentralized services could be replicated. And that was the big lesson I learned there, which is actually what I tend to call the political context really determines what's possible in any situation. And I didn't really study partnerships systematically until I returned to the UK, started to work in ODI on the interface between research and policy. Since most of the work that ODI did was in partnership with other organisations, we did a study of partnerships. We called it Partnerships and Accountability. How are organisations thinking about this? So we looked at the big government-funded programmes like CEDA, DFID, independent research organisations like IDRC, the Swiss Commission for Research Partnerships, foundations like the Wellcome Foundation, all talked about 4 key dimensions. And this is a classic academic slide, far too many words, don't try and read them. 4 key dimensions: access to timely and accurate information, transparency, the terms of engagement, which Romina talked quite a lot about earlier on, legitimacy of the engagement and the relationship, and who is working with whom and why, and what's the convergence of interest, etc. And then a transparent process and a sort of inclusive management and governance arrangements. And this was way back in 2005. We came up with some nice partnership principles for ODI in 2007. Here they are, 1 to 6. Partners will share a vision of the value of the partnership, the intended objectives and outcomes. Partners will respond to each other's needs and the needs of their beneficiaries. Partners will promote transparency by sharing information in open and timely fashion, will share outputs fairly. Partners' contribution will be recognised. Partnership will adapt to changing circumstances, and partners will maintain their independence. And we learned very, very quickly, it's fantastically difficult to do this in a contract-driven, highly competitive, results-based research funding environment, where very often the lead organisation is commissioned to produce the result and works in theory in partnership with its partners, but actually that the relationship is completely distorted by the way in which the work is contracted. The best set of principles I've ever come across about how to do this were produced by the Swiss Academy of Sciences, KFPE, and they came up with 11 principles for what they called effective transboundary partnerships, first developed in 2002, renewed in 2012, still absolutely relevant today. And I'm not going to read them. Many of these are things which Romina talked about in her presentation. And they also came up with 7 questions that you should ask yourself if you're trying to set up a partnership. And again, I'm not going to read all of these. These are all very well known, and Romina and Louise have already talked about many of them today. So not rocket science here, and known about for a very long time. I joined INAS about 18 months ago, partly because they had really good relationships with their partners in the south, and both in the north and the south, actually, for actually doing these sorts of things really well. They were fantastically lucky. They managed to hang on to core funding from research donors who were committed to these sorts of things for much longer than most other organizations. So they were able to invest the time and the resources in these sorts of relationship building principles. And we still have a set of values which underpin this: in it together, collaborating with partners to co-design, co-develop projects, making change last, working with partners to enable them to continue beyond the end of every project. Every voice counts, actively seeking to address issues of power and equity within our work, and doing things right, being fair, honest, open and accountable. But most of our core funding has now gone, and we are now finding it fantastically difficult to do this. So we, and I mean we, not INAS, we collectively, the whole development research community, we know very well how to do this kind of stuff. It's been well described for decades. Why is it still a problem? Why is it so difficult? And the answer, I think, lies in politics. And partly that's what I would call big P politics. So the shifting sands of public and politicians' interest in development cooperation, the pressure from the public to see tangible results from development spending, the shift towards short-term output-driven contracts to deliver research demanded by donors rather than research driven by the need and interests of people. And what is the forthcoming merger between DFID and FCO mean for all of that? I don't know, but I'm very nervous. I was working very closely with AusAid when they were merged into DFAT, and essentially it pretty much destroyed the Australian Development Research Programme for about more than 5 years. But it's also partly what I would call small p politics, and that's the interests and incentives driving northern researchers and other northern partners, particularly northern researchers, for example. They need to get peer-reviewed publications so that they can get proper paid jobs. You can't get contracts now unless you've got your track record in peer-reviewed publications. We should all have proper jobs. We can't blame them for wanting to get proper jobs, but that requirement to get peer-reviewed publications inevitably distorts the relationship between northern researchers and southern research, and there are lots of others as well, and that's not the only one. But I think there are glimmers of hope, and Romina's already talked about some of them. The emphasis on equitable partnerships, and now I'm slightly nervous about using that term. Equitable partnerships, capacity building and GCRF funded projects, although as the ICAI review showed, much better at the language, the rhetoric than the reality. Long-term research partnerships funded by Wellcome Trust and CEDA. And what we must do is try as hard as we can in the current climate to maintain effective, equitable research partnerships, demonstrate that that's the best way to get evidence to underpin sustainable development, and to use that to persuade more donors to provide research funding in ways that support rather than undermine them. And who knows, maybe the COVID-19 crisis and the Black Lives Matter movement might also persuade developed country governments and researchers that strong southern research capacity is essential for a sustainable future. And the best way to get there is through supporting effective, equitable research partnerships. Let's hope so. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Oh, thanks very much. That was really fascinating. All right, we've had 3 really interesting speakers talk about, and and many of the challenges that we talk about are very similar, despite your perspectives from coming at this from very different angles. So we'd like to open this up to the audience. Do we have any questions that have come through?
We don't have any yet, but if you want to ask a question, please just raise your hand. And then we'll get to you. Okay, and then I'll take the chair's prerogative here. I mean, I think, how do we avoid this, the linguistic gymnastics, that we're currently in about equitable partnerships, and how do we ensure that we capture these funds? Because, like John pointed out, partnerships are long-term. They develop over time. They require funding over time. And we are in a very short-term kind of environment with even more pressures on budgets. So, how can we take this forward? The challenges are huge. So that's open. That's all to everyone, to all of our speakers. Go ahead.
Should I go first?
Sure.
I mean, I think this is at the heart, at the heart of the matter. We've been talking about it at SOAS, and we're really genuinely committed to having that collaboration that is reciprocal and mutually beneficial, and we want to support our partners, not by imposing, a certain type of support, but when it's asked, when we, our contribution is considered valuable, and I think it's not so much about the language, and I think the point of my presentation was not that you can't use one word or the other, although the developing I do have an issue with, but it's really about, when we use a language, we need to understand what it means and what it doesn't mean, right? So sometimes we say equitable, but we do know the realities, the structural factors that don't allow us, that make it very hard for us to have those relationships. So one of the things that emerges, obviously having long-term relationships of trust with partners, research partners or communities, being really grounded, being in communication with your communities or partners all the time, not just when a project opportunity emerges, but actually having that long-term relationship, that goes beyond the professional objectives and goals, but actually having that communication. And then, I think you also then have that trust and respect that can bring everyone together when a project proposal or an idea does develop, whether it is by the northern partner or by the southern partner. And the other thing that we have been talking about, I think, is more about a dialogical collaboration, right? So it's not just, I think it's the process of it, right? It's the process that matters very much, not simply the objective. Having that dialogue being explicit about your expectations. Oftentimes in these proposals, as you know, the ERC, for instance, not just the GCRF, but we have a lot of ERC funded projects that happen in Africa and Asia. Now, these projects need to be developed by a single PI, single project, and oftentimes PIs are discouraged to have partners because the bureaucracy around setting up partnerships is really complicated. And then you appear without, then you have to add informal partners and so forth, and it creates all sorts of issues. How do you build partnerships in that case then, when the structure is so rigid about the PI leading? I think that then you really need to be creative. And I'll quote Professor Lindy Widovi, who is leading a project at SOAS on decolonizing film and screen studies in Africa. And she said, she comes from the arts, and she said, well, I'd like to talk about creative partnerships, because you have to have creativity to find a way to make this dialogical and to get everyone to contribute without really imposing a certain agenda. So you really have to think creatively, and if you're really committed, I would say.
Okay, thank you. And John? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, no, I've unmuted myself. Yeah, I agree with everything that Romina has said. And I'd just like to say a couple of other things. One is to agree with what Louisa said right at the beginning, that actually part of this is a journey of personal change. And we need to change our own attitudes and recognise that we no longer set the agenda. And I think that's quite a challenge for quite a lot of people who are used to setting the agenda, particularly PIs who are not only used to doing it, but are stuck in a system which kind of forces them to do it. But the other thing I just want to say is I think we need to bring in more of the arts and humanities. I think the challenge now is not so much what to do. We know how to do effective partnerships, but we don't do them. We know how to set up decentralized animal healthcare services, but we don't do them. The question is, why don't we do these things? And I think we need to have a much longer more detailed understanding of the historical, the psychological, the ethical, the cultural ways in which ideas have evolved. And some of Romina's work on epistemology is very important in there. And actually, that I think is the root of the problem. And we need to bring in more of those disciplines into the development process.
Louisa, do you want to add to that, or do you want to come in on that?
Yes, sure, definitely. Thank you. So yeah, I think it's actually on the Rural Water Supply Network. We recently, it's a kind of a discussion group, and as I said, there's about 11,000 members and a lot of different people coming from different places. And there's recently been a discussion started from somebody, a governance specialist in Kenya, Euphrasia, and she's been raised the whole point of kind of knowledge and the kind of colonization of knowledge, and how the idea of expertise, relative expertise, is unequal. So that if you're an advisor or a specialist from a northern or a university academic or institution, your knowledge is considered to be somehow superior to the local knowledge that comes actually sort of indigenous knowledge, which is often, John just said about, we know how all these things ought to work, but they don't work. Well, they don't work because of, often because of context, as you said, about politics, about the local kind of incentives and power relationships that are operating, and the kind of the way that that solutions and research and so on is conceptualized comes from a very particular sort of tends to come from, as Romina was saying, the kind of the epistemological kind of the position. Even just the very conceptualization of problems is very biased by where the kind of research and publications have been coming from. And so this whole discussion has been on, so how do we change that dynamic? And actually quite a lot of the discussion came down to pay, that consultants from the north are paid more than consultants from national consultants. That's one thing. How are the different areas of expertise valued by the funding, by the funders? And so therefore, what prominence does it get, and what kind of influence does it have over how problems are articulated, how solutions, or how the research questions are articulated? and how they become, who kind of leads and who's involved in that discussion, what direction the discussion goes in. So I think there's a huge amount of kind of reflection needed on that in development, particularly because we know that there are, solutions are not to do with who's got the best answer to a logical answer to the situation. It is about people, and it is about how they interact. And so I think it's a very interesting time we're in. But I think we have this is the question I think that we all need to address, is where do we all fit in, where do we add value, and who needs to be framing the questions and the issues that we look at.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I would just have one small comment about interdisciplinary research. It's not the great leveler. Different topics, different expertise have different dominance in these discussions. So that's another layer of bias that we have to add into this. Sure, John.
You've lit one of my other blue touch papers there with the word interdisciplinary. Of course, we have to do interdisciplinary research, but actually, I think we need to go one step further and do what I call transdisciplinary research. So it is not the academics deciding what the question is and how they're going to find the answers to the questions, even if they combine their different methodologies and their different epistemologies and all that kind of stuff. It's actually a collaborative process working with all the other actors, particularly the actors who have a really strong interest in the outcome, to identify what the problem is, identify what existing research knowledge there is, what are the knowledge gaps, and the researcher's job then is to try and plug those knowledge gaps in as interdisciplinary a way as they possibly can. And then other words which Romina talked about, which I think are really important but often very misused, then it's the co-analysis of the results of that work, and it's the co-production of the recommendations. So I think we need to be promoting transdisciplinary research, although some people actually define interdisciplinary in the way that I define transdisciplinary. It's actually by bringing all the stakeholders together and it being a collaborative exercise, working on commonly identified problems in which each stakeholder can play their own part in a very modest, humble way.
Thank you for that. All right, we have a question from Oliver Trumbull on the chat. And his question is this: is there still a role for partnership at all levels, local and global? And if so, how do we ensure a strong connectivity between all levels and avoid perpetuating the colonization of knowledge?
That's a big question.
We've got another one. We have another couple of big questions on the chat. Thank you, Oliver, for that.
I have a few thoughts, if I may.
Sure.
Because I have been developing a project, actually, a multi-country project, and it's all about developing culture-sensitive domestic violence alleviation mechanisms, but it's a trans-boundary, and it's all about the user and public engagement. And I think this might answer partially the question. What we can do is to think precisely about, conceptualize the project and build it, right? So that there are components of public engagement throughout, components that allow for the conversation to happen, more workshops, more conferences, and not just in the North, but in various LMICs, in various countries, so that mobility doesn't restrict the same individuals every time. Use virtual platforms, multilingual platforms for impact dissemination, to reach different users. We're setting up a platform to reach seminarians and clergy, and a platform because we work in religious societies and domestic violence, and then a platform to reach the secular domestic violence providers. So you really have to think about who your users are, right? Who are your audiences? Who are your target groups? And try to really engage with them in appropriate ways, right? Because it's context-specific ways, different ways. You have to be very creative. I think, Lindy, we really hit the nail on the head here, that it's about creativity.
Okay, thank you. Do other speakers want to add to that? Or?
Yeah, I'm happy to add something. I think it is interesting, and I mean, I think it's interesting because in WaterAid as an international NGO, we have we have colleagues across the world And so sort of within the institution, you know, there are opportunities for really collaborating and joining up. And it's not, you know, it's not easy. All the kind of challenges that have come out about the language that's used and so on are there. But I think the kind of having the genuine intention that that the solutions are only, that is the only way. You know, you have to lose this kind of unconscious bias of that, you know, that somehow rich countries know best what to do, which is so often somehow there, and to be able to kind of listen properly to each other. And also, you know, it's quite a lot of, there's a lot of work to go on. So, for example, I mean, I agree with Romina about, you know, languages, different forums, different people, and that's a lot of work to be able to set that up. But that's very important. On the RW, the Rural Water Supply Network, you know, we sort of try and translate everything into French and Spanish and English, so discussions are multilingual like that. But what about Hindi and Chinese and Vietnamese? And, you know, there's a lot of people who don't speak those languages. So it's kind of being aware of different kinds of communication channels at a starting point, and being, I think, very determined that has to be done. You know, it's more difficult, it's more expensive, it takes longer, but you know, in the end, it's essential. So I'll stop there.
Okay.
Can I add a comment about the expenses? Sorry, John, just because this is precisely what Luisa said about expenses. One of the things we're trying to push for with the funders is to be able to cover the costs for some of these activities, right? Whether it is dissemination or impact, but even at the level of conceptualization, when you need to bring, let's say you need a workshop to conceptualize a project and you need to bring the stakeholders together, these costs we should have some room there to be covered by the funders, because we can't assume them. And I'm just wondering, Luisa, if there's, you know, if you could pitch that to a donor, what is the behavior of the donors in terms of the NGO world? Would they be willing to cover some costs for impact dissemination, or, you know, building those relationships? I'm just curious to know.
I mean, I think obviously it depends on the donor, but I think we have to fight for it. You know, if whether it's a research or it's a sort of an implementation project, or a, you know, a sort of program, to have that proper what we call, you know, the inception phase. You say, we don't know what the problems are. We know broadly this is the issue, but we don't actually know what they are really, or the best way to address it, until we've had these more detailed engagement. And I think increasingly donors are willing, you know, do understand that. I mean, I don't know whether under the sort of new you know, situation, how that will continue. But I mean, quite a lot of serious development donors will say, yeah, obviously you need to do that. You need to be able to consult. You need to be able to do a lot of kind of analysis underneath to be able to say what is the right, you know, question, what is the problem. So I think that's there, but I don't know how that'll play out, because it does take time and money. But I mean, I think it's there because everyone is sick of sort of non-sustainable, you know, project. People just do something, and then, you know, within a year after it's finished, it's not really relevant anymore. So yeah, I think so.
Okay. We've got, oh, sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I think we need to be prepared to do is to do much more self-critical evaluations of these things. We say partnerships are important, capacity development is important, transdisciplinary methods of working are important. We really need to be prepared to come up with some really good mechanisms, robust mechanisms to evaluate whether that really does deliver better developmental outcomes. And that's one of the things that academics in particular seem to be particularly cautious about, evaluating the impact of their research. I think if we don't do that, if we don't generate really convincing, rigorous economic evidence of impact, it will be very difficult to persuade the donors to fund the sorts of things which we think are necessary, the sorts of things which Louisa and Romina have been talking about.
Okay, we've got three final questions, and I know we're a little bit over time, so we're going to have to wrap up. From Simon Early, what impact does the panel think that contracting or the contractivizing of development will have or has had on developing equitable partnerships? Thank you, Simon, for that question.
Sorry, the contract?
The contract, you know, the contract, I think he's referring to the big kind of consulting firms and contracting these large projects out. And Go ahead.
I can go ahead. John, you go ahead. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said in my presentation, that's one of the things which has really undermined this, contracting things out, particularly through the large accountancy companies, which I think is an appalling thing to do. I mean, why would they ever commission PwC to run a research program, or who is it who's running the COVID testing thing at the moment so disastrously? Why would they think that big consultancy firms can manage these things effectively? So there's that. It's the wrong people managing the stuff. They're also looking at the wrong metrics of performance. It's all results-based. Looking at very tangible results when in fact we all know that the real changes are sort of social, societal and political. So I think this has been a major constraint actually to developing better partnerships.
No, I mean, I agree. I think it's very problematic because you're getting the downward kind of focus on compliance and answerability to the donors, which completely disincentivizes the kind of the sharing of the power, or the devolving of power to local and to be responsive to the realities. So it's very difficult unless you like really build that argument. We have to maybe say this is what and so then they just have to manage that. But I think it's a big challenge. Yeah. Good question. Thank you, Simon Obi.
Okay, and we have a question from Naomi Bull. How can we form strong partnerships with end users, not only just with NGOs? It'd be great to hear the speaker's thoughts on how we can integrate end users within research prioritization setting. Thanks, Naomi.
I think this answers also my answer previously to the other question also answers this, having different pathways to engage the different users. So that means that when you conceptualize the project, you really need to understand what communities, what stakeholders you engage, and identify specific mechanisms within that project very early on of how you're going to communicate with each and what kind of outputs or deliverables or milestones that you might wish to achieve. And unfortunately, I'm using this language because this is the language of the funders. But you could think of impact, you could think of outputs, you could think of benefits, and have those identified in the projects, because it won't happen as an afterthought. You really have to think about it in the very beginning of the project development.
I mean, I think the whole research priority setting agenda is a very interesting one. And again, that's riddled with kind of biases and whose agenda. And you spoke to this, whose demand for research counts, or who's trumps. And it often isn't the community level. And how do you change that? It's very difficult. And I think we had one more question from Jazz Cower. I wonder to what extent the panelists agree that we should be advocating for change to the project application procedures and criteria so that Southern partners can be PIs and Northern partners co-Is, and also whether they have experience of ethnographic models of evaluation, and can we share insights to the value these might have? Thank you. That was an excellent question. Go ahead. Okay.
Like at school, if I stick my hand up highest and wave, can I answer first? The answer to the first part is yes, absolutely. Of course we should be. We need the evidence to do that. The answer to the second question is yes, there are some really good evaluation techniques, particularly, I'm not sure you'd call them ethnographic, but certainly highly participatory approaches which look at what has been achieved within the context within which you're working. So they're reflexive from that point of view. And they're called performance stories. And there's an approach called collaborative outcomes reporting, which involves all different stakeholders actually trying to assess whether what they've achieved and how they got there, and whether the assumptions underpinning that approach work. So I'm very happy to share information about those if you want to know more.
Great, thank you.
Did Luisa also want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted just to share a quick kind of like, I mean, actually, we're involved at the moment in some collaborative research on accountability, and it's sort of embedded with researchers who are from different institutions in the different countries where the research is going, so that the kind of the inquiry about accountability is coming from the institutions that are trying to kind of develop their understanding, but also going straight back into it. And it's actually funded by the donor who required proper partnership with institutions in the global north and global south, which has, you know, and setting it up has taken a year, and they said you've got a year to kind of work out what the questions are and to do it together. And I think that, you know, it's slow, you know, it is slow, and it requires a lot of discussion and negotiation, but in that discussion negotiation, when you have that playing field set where you say no, the funder actually requires this proper shared research, shared, you know, both in terms of conceptualization and the application, it kind of forces everyone to say, okay, we can't just come in and say no, I'm sorry, we're organizing this and you've just got to kind of fit our timeline and everything. So there is that way of kind of and so maybe, you know, if more donors see that as something that we can say, this is, you know, if you really want these questions, the real questions to be addressed, then this is the sort of process that is needed. But we're still at the starting phase, so yeah.
Okay, great.
And I just want to add that this is precisely what we're working on at SOAS, to not to apply pressure, but to really be in conversation with the funders and make them realize that some of the requirements are simply not conducive to beneficial partnerships and good projects. The tight deadlines, for instance, is a big point of contention, and they know that. Funders know that. We had Sarah Plowman from UKRI in the last event. She knows that. Everyone is aware. And there are some calls that allow for the PI, or require that the PI be based in an LMIC country, in a DAC-listed country. I think it's the global networks. And that's fine. That's, I guess it's a step forward, but it also comes with other challenges, right? It doesn't necessarily eschew the other issues, the normative inequalities and hierarchies, and the structural capacity-related differences, or various other issues that still, sort of perpetuate these inequalities and asymmetries. So I think just changing eligibility criteria is not necessarily the solution. It won't be necessarily a panacea, but it is important to revisit some of the requirements. And we are actually really actively seeking that, because I think we just need to fine tune certain things. It doesn't need huge changes. Some due diligence requirements. Currently, and I do want to say this, and I'll end here. A lot of funders expect institutions in the UK to do the due diligence of their partners in the LMIC's countries. So the UK institutions take accountability, essentially, of everything they promise to the funders in relation to their partners' performance, whether it is anti-corruption, whether it is anything, efficiency, and I think that places an unfair amount of stress on the UK-based institutions, and I think it is a sort of an indirect way for the funders to delegate the responsibility that they should be taking. So I think these are the kind of issues that we really need to be aware of, and be bold with the funders, with the donors, and say, look, some issues are your responsibility, and you need to rethink how your requirements.
Okay, thank you very much. And I really want to, I know we've gone a little bit over, but I really, really want to thank our speakers for their you've taken us on this tremendous journey in an hour and a half. So thank you for that. And I'm gonna ask you very briefly to give our audience just a 2-sentence takeaway as a summation. And of course, this broadcast will be putting up on our web. So shall we start with Louisa, please?
Takeaway. So yeah, I mean, it's a good opportunity now with COVID, I think, and with the Black Lives Matters, to kind of really reframe the way that we investigate these key questions on development. And I'm very excited about that. And as we've been saying, you need to kind of you know, we who are involved in it need to really try and push for the conditions that that's possible.
Great, thank you. Romina?
I would say that this is it's a challenging time, and everyone has been affected. But I think it can be resourceful in forcing us to think differently, to think creatively, and to appreciate the resourcefulness of our partners, the communities we work with, but also to appreciate our own limitations. I do think that there is a different approach to international development. I am debating this with myself, whether there is or not, but I think there is, and it really depends on what John said, and Luis actually said that, on our commitment to do that. If we are committed to doing it in a different way, with humility, I don't think we can go wrong. I don't think that when you're humble to listen and to learn, I don't think that can be pernicious, right? I think there is always a learning there to be gained. So I would speak of attitudes and self-reflection.
Great, thank you. And John?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that, and just say it's been really interesting hearing everybody speak, and I think the questions themselves illustrate that there's a tremendous enthusiasm across the whole sector for doing this, and let's try and do more of, I think, what Louisa talked about practically in her talk, and Romina talked about from a slightly more analytical academic point of view in terms of collaborating, sort of multi-level collaborations with all different stakeholders, and we can try and make this happen.
Great. And I want to thank our audience today for your great questions. And I hope that this is the beginning of our partnership journey here at LIDC, and this is the beginning of first event, and that we'll carry on this discussion, and we'll have more to talk about later. So please follow us on social media, and we're absolutely delighted to host this event. So thanks very much, and best wishes, and
thank you, everyone.
We will speak again, I hope, soon.
All the best. Stay safe and healthy.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye now.